Hello, Howie Bentley here. Welcome to episode 4 of Sword and Sorcery Heavy Metal. Today I'm going to be talking with Petros Leptos, the vocalist and primary lyricist for Solitary Sabred. Solitary Sabred is a heavy metal band hailing from Cyprus. Let's see what all interesting things Petros has to say. Hey Petros, how are you today?
Hey, Howie, I'm good. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing awesome. Good to see you.
Good to see you. This is very trippy. I feel like I'm playing in a minor league basketball team and I'm getting interviewed by Michael Jordan or something, for real.
Oh, geez, I'm so flattered. Oh, okay. So, tell us about the meaning behind Solitary Saber. I'm sure a lot of people would like to hear that. It's a very unique name. And nowadays, if you don't want somebody taking your name, you're in a metal band, then the first thing you do is look on Metal Archives and make sure that there's no band name what you want to name your band. But the best thing to do is come up with a very unique name like Solitary Saber. So if you would go into a little bit of the inspiration behind the band name and also a brief history of Solitary Saber.
All right, so the name, it predated my admission to the band, but the logic behind it was that the word solitary is pretty self-explanatory. The word saber basically comes from saber, but because some people write it with an ER, some people write it with an ED, with an RE. If you put the D in the end, it becomes super characteristic, right? Jimmy's our guitar player, started the band while jamming with some friends when he was in late high school. But then everyone left for studies. Jimmy's was the only one who was really in this type of music anyway. So when we met a few years down the line and decided to form a band, which is another story in itself, we were looking for a name, and he said, I've got this name of an old band, Solitary Sabred. Now, we're both, as you know, really into occult US heavy metal, where you've got a lot of bands like Slaughter, Extroys, and those weird type of names, right? So Solitary Sabred, I think, fits that type of name where if you first hear it, it's going to take a while to process, but once you learn it, it's quite characteristic, so we chose to roll with it. You can loosely translate it as lone swordsman, let's say.
Okay, well, that's a very good name for the band, considering the music and the lyrical themes. So what can you tell us about the formation of the band and just a brief history of the recording and some of the gigs? Or I don't know if you've done touring or much extensive touring, but a little bit about that.
So the formation of the band, as I said, Jimmy's was rolling around with the name, and there's a couple of songs that date back to those days, basically a couple of riffs. But the band essentially started from the ground up when I met Jimmy's. We both came back from our studies in Cyprus. It must have been around 2006 maybe, and we met at a gig. And we instantly became best of friends. The thing about Cyprus is that people my age, I'm 42 now, when we were growing up, there was literally 0 people listening to this type of heavy metal, right? So we would really have to dig deep to find material because there was no internet, obviously, in those days. So I'm half Greek, so whenever I'd go to Greece, I'd go to record stores and dig in and try and find stuff and listen to stuff because I had that bug. My older cousins, they have a kick-ass heavy metal band in Cyprus called Orion Path. So they were the ones that sort of got me into it, and then I got hooked onto the more occult US stuff. So when we first met, as I said, it's really hard to find people who like this type of music in our island, so we instantly gelled and became best of friends. And then Jimmy's mentioned that he plays the guitar. I mentioned that I sing and play the bass, which I did at a very beginner level at the time. I had a band when I was in the university and we just jammed stuff. So it started from there. And one thing leads to another. Our first live our first live gig ever. We decided to record it and release it on a DVD. Talk about, complete lack of awareness of danger, which garnered the interest of a couple of underground labels, and it sort of rolled from there. In terms of gigs, we tried to be pretty active, most of it in Cyprus, because the problem of living in a small island in the middle of nowhere is that it's pretty hard to get to places to play because there's a big expense involved. So, but we do play often in Cyprus. We played a few gigs in Greece. We're playing again in Greece, in Athens and Thessaloniki in April. And hopefully in the summer, we'll be able to do our first European tour. So
that would be great. You guys have so there are no festivals booked though in Europe?
There are dates being discussed, but we can't announce anything yet until it's been finalized.
I understand. Okay, so how did you get into listening to heavy metal, and how old were you?
As I said, my two older cousins were really into it. They were basically some of the first people in Cyprus to play heavy metal. I remember myself, being like 10, 11 years old and going to my cousin's house and seeing those Iron Maiden posters on the wall. I was like, what's that awesome thing? So I was about 13, 14 years old. And I remember we were playing video games with my younger cousin. And then my older cousins in the other room, they were listening to Manowar, and the song was Guyana. So, as I was playing, I hear this, voice, Guyana, and which at the time I thought said Diana, but that's the point. Anyway, so I started looking into it, and then a really good friend of mine who's also my best man, Paris Lambru, he's a bass player. He has a great band called Astronomicon. I'm plugging bands now from friends. And he used to work at a record store, the only sort of record store in Nicosia that would bring some heavy metal stuff. And because he's a big Manowar fan, he brought in the first Manowar albums. So I went and bought, which one was it? Hail to England. So I literally remember just putting it in a CD player in my room, to the other room. I don't know what I was about to do, and then it starts, and you know how Blood of My Enemy starts, ba bam 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 bam. I'm like, what's that? I was in the other room, and then as it starts, ba 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 ba, and I hear that, and I went back and replayed that single scream like 100 times before I moved to the next one, because I've never heard anything like that. It was instantly mind blown. Then I found out there was a show on Cypriot radio by a great producer called Robert Kamasa, which played rock stuff. So on that same night, I went in and listened to it, and it played Stargazer by Rainbow. And I first imagined listening to Eric Adams and Dio on the same day, right? So that was pretty much it. It was like, so then I started looking for stuff to listen to.
Yeah, well, that's certainly understandable. That's quite some inspiration there. So you have a new album out. Yeah, you want to tell us a little, and it's not been released, but what, maybe a month at the most?
Yes, it was released on the 15th of September. But before I tell you about the album, there was one part of the story that I forgot to mention. You know it because I've told you before. That's how I started listening to heavy metal. When I decided to start playing heavy metal, I was reading a Greek magazine called Metal Invader. And there was a Cauldron Born interview where I still remember the words. I'm paraphrasing a bit because it was in Greek, I'm sure. But it said that, you said that, they asked you the same question, why did you start playing heavy metal? And you said, because I wanted to make the best heavy metal album for me, according to my taste. So when I read that, I was a massive Cauldron Born fan. And later on, I'm going to reveal the exact parts that we nicked to put in our albums, okay? So when I read that interview, it was like a switch going off. And I'm, that makes sense. I need to make the perfect heavy metal album for me. So that's when I decided to start playing. I went and bought a base on monthly payments the next day.
Well, thank you. That made my day.
So to go back to your original question, sorry, the album was out on the 15th of December by the Greek label Vinyl Store, and we're very grateful and very humbled because it's basically nearly sold out at this point.
That's killer. That is very impressive. Yeah. So what can you tell us about the musical direction and some of the lyrical themes on the new album? And the title of the new album is The Temple of the Serpent, correct? Okay.
So the lyrical themes, initially it wasn't planned to be a concept album. It was more, like a collection of short stories. Then we wrote The Skeleton King, which talks about an undead king who sacrificed his kingdom to bring back his queen, and that seemed like a really, cool sword and sorcery fantasy story. So we decided to take the existing songs, change the lyrics, and start writing new songs in that direction. A lot of musical sort of relation between them. So it wasn't that hard to do. And we started working on that direction. At the same time, I was reading a history book about the fall of the Akkad Empire, the Sumerian Empire. So we decided to put sword and sorcery and Sumerian history together, and it gelled into the lyrical direction of the album. The musical direction, I think it's the natural next step in our progression. I mean, it's not like we sit down and say, this album we're going to do this, or that album we're going to do that. It's just what comes sort of naturally as we mature, quote unquote, as songwriters.
So I guess you would say it was a natural progression from By Fire and Brimstone, then, the previous album.
Yeah, By Fire and Brimstone, it was a sort of a transitional period because we had a member change in the drummer position. Now that the lineup is steady, we're all able to sort of grow together because we don't have to go back, learn the new songs and all that. Plus, this time we've got our own studio, so we've got more time to work on things, which is a blessing and a curse because you can go into the loop of over-analyzing and over-adjusting, and you know how it goes. So we had the time to listen to the songs. We did a sort of small pre-production. And wherever there was too much bloat, we'd cut some things out. So the songs were molded perhaps into a more, I won't say straightforward because not quite straightforward, but a more tighter, I'd say, direction than By Fire and Brimstone, perhaps.
Okay. And you started off with The Hero, the Monster, the Myth. And that was a sort of a raw, great debut album. From a metal band. And now some of the lyrical themes on that, would you mind discussing some of the highlights? And let me, before we get into that, let me ask you, there's also one on there, I think the title of the song is The Trojan Hero, is that correct?
Yep.
And so can you tell me a little bit about the relationship between Troy and Cyprus?
So in Cyprus, we're basically the original Cyprus settlers were Greek tribes that came down from Greece and settled in Cyprus. So Cyprus and Greece, it's basically the same people. However, we're also close to the Middle East. So we've got influences coming in from there. Plus, half of Cyprus, as you know, has been invaded by Turkey. So it's like half Greek, half Turkish now. So there's that blend of civilizations going on. So yeah, the first Greek settlers, they came down in Cyprus in the ancient days, and Greek history moves parallel to Cypriot history moves parallel to Greek history. So the song Trojan Hero is about a tragic figure named Eandas, or Eas in English. He was a great warrior who was blinded by the goddess Athene. And when he went to slaughter the Greek enemies, Athene made him see a flock of sheep as enemies. So he slaughtered the sheep instead of his enemies. And that was a great blemish to his honor. So he propped up his sword and impaled himself. And that's the story that we deal with in the song.
Yeah, the very cool lyrics in that song. I mean, the whole album, the lyrical themes are really cool, but that one stood out particularly. I was listening to it again yesterday and reading the lyrics. Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, the side note is that's the only solitary Sabred song that I only modified the lyrics to. Most of them had been written before me, so that's the only one I haven't written all of the lyrics for. Yeah.
Okay. So now the next, well, let's see, we're on the Hero, the Monster, the Myth. So the next album is Redemption Through Force, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is a concept album, if I'm not mistaken.
It is.
Yeah. And could you really summarize the story, give us a synopsis of the whole story there behind Redemption Through Force?
So Redemption Through Force, the first song we wrote for that one was Burn Magic, Black Magic. And we really liked the song and the lyrical theme and all that. And we thought, why not do a concept album, based around that. So the story is that there's a guy named Jacob Kramer, who's a crusader. He left his wife, who at the time was pregnant with child he did not know, went to the Crusades, fought at the Damascus Gate when Jerusalem fell to Saladin's hordes, then came back to England, and I'm cutting a long story short, but he becomes an exorcist because it was the times before the Holy Inquisition started. It was the first, witch persecutions and that kind of stuff. So we thought it was cool to couple that with a bit of medieval history. So we found a couple of places where there were hauntings reported and all that. And we put the characters there. Now, the eerie part about the story is that he's got an antagonist called Sarah Lancaster, who in the album turns out to be his daughter. Now, this Sarah Lancaster was locked up in a convent and she was tortured by nuns and all that until she sees a vision of her mom and she gets possessed and becomes a witch. Now, what we did not know when we were writing this is that there's actually a true story somewhere, a myth about a girl called Sarah Lancaster who was locked up in a convent and became a witch and all that, which we didn't know at the time and only found out later. So there must be some possession going on. Second eerie thing, the girl who posed for the album cover, which is a painting, was also named Sarah.
Quite a coincidence.
The third coincidence, at the time, I went to sort of state fair and there was a fortune teller there, right? And she says, "Can I read your hand?" And I said, sure. So she places her palm on my palm and instantly goes like, whoop. And I'm, what's going on? And she says, "I can't read you. Why? You're possessed. By what? By a female spirit." So, that's a lot of coincidences there.
That's awesome. Well, there are several themes in that for future albums. But that would make a great story in itself, the lyrics to Redemption Through Force. And speaking of stories, now you had a story that you had written for an anthology called Barbarian Crowns.
Yes.
You want to tell us a little bit about that?
So I was invited. I'm sure you were to blame to write a story for the anthology. So I came with a character called the Bard, who I had in my mind for a bit and was considering writing a couple of songs about. and basically decided to turn him into a vampire hunter. The main theme of the story is that sometimes there's more than meets the eye, because even though he looks like, basically a homeless person, it turns out he's this, kick-ass anti-hero vampire hunter, which is, the basic theme behind the story. I hope that at some point I find some time to expand on it, but I must say I don't have the time to write as much as I did in the past. Only lyrics now, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's very hard to find time to split between music and writing fiction. And but you had that one story published. Have you had any other stories published besides that story in Barbarian Crowns?
No, just that one. I've had scientific articles published, but that's a whole other ballgame.
Oh yeah, that's impressive as well. But we'll save that for another interview.
Yes.
Okay, so the sword and sorcery themes, they're very prominent in the music or the lyrics of Solitary Sabred. So what was your first contact, your first exposure to sword and sorcery fiction?
So my first exposure was around 10 years old. My sister, she lives in Athens, and there was a kiosk, a newsstand next to her apartment, which carried the old Greek editions of Conan the Barbarian comic books. They were, black and white, printed on really crappy paper, the type you touch and your fingers turn black. But the first time I got one of those, I was instantly hooked. So within the length of a summer holiday, I got all the issues. I found the company that was printing them. I got all the back issues because they were discontinued at that point. And that was my first exposure. The old Conan the Barbarian comic books, Roy Thomas, John Buscema, those guys. Yeah.
So have you read a lot of sword and sorcery fiction as far as, paperbacks, the Howard text, or some of the pastiche novels of Conan and so on?
Yeah, over time, I've read everything Conan related. I got, big leather-bound anthologies that have all the stories and the novels in them, and, Hour of the Dragon and the Phoenix on the Sword, and all that stuff, which has a way of creeping into our lyrics from time to time. I read, and it sort of grew from there. Other Howard characters and so on and so forth.
Were there other authors that you like to read other than Howard? Could you maybe name a few of those?
Many. Truth be told, in the last 3-4 years, I'm not reading as much as I used to. I mean, sword and sorcery stuff, because I'm suddenly addicted to metal biographies. I've read 50 of them over the last few years. Which one was it? AC/DC's Brian Johnson. But yeah, over the years, I've read a lot of sword and sorcery stuff, and a lot of fantasy stuff. Where would you draw the line between sword and sorcery and high fantasy, let's say?
Where would I draw the line? You mean cite examples of authors, or what?
If we consider high fantasy, I don't know, Lord of the Rings, let's say.
Tolkien, yeah.
So sword and sorcery stuff. I love Howard. I love Moorcock's books. Elric, Coram Jalen Irsay, Hawkmoon, those were amazing. I really when the internet first started, someone had scanned old Weird Tale books. The Weird Tales, those they used to publish, so I started reading authors like Moore. What was the Jirel of
Jory.
I forget the name.
Yeah. Jarrell Jordan.
The strong female, archetype. The Tyranny book, Simon Magus, The Scroll of Thought, those novels. So yeah, too many to mention. Over time, I've been reading a bunch. A very neglected sword and sorcery sort of subgenre that I see, because it's within a game universe, is, I don't know if you've ever read any of the Black Library books.
I am not.
So Black Library is, if you're familiar with the game Warhammer, the miniature war game.
I know about it. I've never played it.
So they've created an incredible universe there, which is really dark fantasy. Imagine, I don't know, I won't say Lord of the Rings, but imagine Lord of the Rings if it's switched on its side, like, I don't know if Frank Miller wrote Lord of the Rings or something, which has a lot of sword and sorcery tropes in it. I think you'd really love things like the Gotrek and Felix novels, where it's a dwarf slayer. He's the main character in our song Slayer's Oath. In their mythology, when a dwarf sees his honor lost, there is only one way to pay the cost, and that's like go into battle against countless enemies and find a heroic death. The only problem with him is that he kills everyone, so he can't find that heroic death. And he has a bard sort of sidekick, which creates a very good dynamic. Or Brunner the bounty hunter, sort of sword and sorcery type bounty hunter. There's a bunch of cool characters in those books that the style is really close to those old low fantasy sword and sorcery books. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. It sounds like you've really covered a lot of ground with your reading there. Okay, I think we've pretty much covered everything today, unless you wanted to talk about something else while we're on here.
Well, I could start interviewing you about the Cauldron Born stuff, but well, one thing I could mention, Born of the Cauldron, second song, right? The part where it goes, Elric, come into the cave, Elric. All right, listen to that one, and then listen to Slayer's Oath, the middle part. Troll Slayer. So we nicked that straight off the first Cauldron Born album.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that. I like your stories. But okay, so that was a great fun fact there. But if you don't have anything else you want to bring up, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up and call it a day for today. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Howie. It was amazing, first of all, to talk in person. We've been talking over the years. Thank you so much. I don't know what to say. I'm quite starstruck and fanboying now, so I hope I wasn't blabbering on too much. No, I enjoyed the conversation with you, and I'm sure my viewers are going to enjoy listening to you talk about all this stuff. But so I'll go ahead and wrap it up. Be sure to pick up the new Solitary Sabred album, The Temple of the Serpent. It's out on which label? On Vinyl Store Records. Okay, Vinyl Store Records. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, this has been Petros Leptos and Howie Bentley for Sword and Sorcery Heavy Metal. Be sure to tune in next week to the next episode of Sword and Sorcery Heavy Metal. See you later.